In today's episode, we'll break down two important stories. First, we'll talk about a scramble for pilots, and then we'll talk about Coal India's brain going public. Welcome back to the Daily Brief by Zerodha, where we cut through the noise to help you understand what's actually happening in the most important stories from business and markets. I'm your host Akshara, and today is Friday, 20th March. Coming to the first story. Does India have enough pilots for its commercial airlines? Headlines from the sector make things seem dire. And in recent years, airlines have announced salary hikes of as much as 40% for their pilots. Just a few days ago, in fact, Akasa announced a generous incentive program to retain its pilots amid poaching fears. The sector has been fending off pressure from Gulf and Southeast Asian carriers, a trend Indigo's former CEO called disturbing. India even formally submitted a working paper to the International Civil Aviation Organization last year asking for the world's help in stopping international airlines from getting their hands on our pilots. Meanwhile, India's own airlines have been luring from abroad. Last year, for instance, a Rajya Sabha reply noted that in the course of a single year, the number of foreign pilots with temporary authorizations to fly in India tripled. It almost seems as though we're desperately short of pilots. In 2024, the Directorate General for Civil Aviation, or DGCA, India's aviation regulator, issued a record 1,628 commercial pilot licenses. It was the most they had ever issued to that point by a comfortable margin. And this was in part because more pilots were entering the workforce than ever before. India now has 40 flight training organizations spread across 62 bases, a leap from 34 schools just 3 years ago. Many of those pilots don't have a clear path to joining India's commercial aviation sector. In this telling, the government seems to make sense when it says there's no shortage of pilots in India. But somehow, both these things are true. India is not short of pilots, yet India is short of very specific kinds of pilots. So 2 years ago, the DGCA published Revised Flight Duty Time Limitations, or FDTL. These are the rules that govern how much a pilot can fly, how long they can be kept on duty, and how much rest they must get between flights. With this, there was a visible drop in the amount of work any airline could ask their pilots to do. Now, to this point, India's rules had been looser than global norms. And that was dangerous. If there was one profession where you could not afford for someone to be fatigued and sleepy because of too many night shifts, it's pilots. The revision brought them closer to international standards. So with these new norms, the load on India's pilots would have to decrease. They would have to be given much more weekly rest, 48 hours instead of 36, and that was effectively one less flying day in a week. They could only be asked to land at night twice a week instead of the previous 6, and the definition of night was tightened. And some loopholes were even tightened. For instance, the standby time as pilots waited for their next flight would cut into their flyable hours. And this was a big transition for any airline. They would need a complete overhaul in how they manage their personnel. And so, airlines were given roughly 20 months to fall in line. We don't have to tell you how that turned out. For now, though, we aren't interested in a single failure, but for what these rules meant to the wider market for pilots. Now, this marked a big change to the baseline of what any pilot could be expected to do. If each pilot now has fewer hours to fly, you would need more to fly the same schedule. According to the Federation of Indian Airlines, the new framework meant that the same pilot would fly between 10 and 20% fewer flights. Many airlines felt the need to increase their pilot strength by as much as a quarter. And since this was happening across the industry, the demand for pilots leapt up all at once. Now, did the new norms put the market under pressure? It isn't clear why on the surface. So India's 6 major domestic airlines together employ around 11,400 pilots. These new norms would add at most a few thousand additional pilots to the mix. Meanwhile, there are over 26,000 licensed commercial pilots in India. More than 1,600 new ones pass through the trailing pipeline every year. On paper, this looks manageable. But the trouble is that a pilot isn't one thing. There's a massive difference between someone being a licensed pilot and someone who would actually pilot your next flight. So to become a commercial pilot, you need a commercial pilot license or a CPL. Now you get this somewhere after 1.5 or 2 years of training once you've flown for about 200 hours and spent more than 500 million in fees. India hands out roughly 1,600 of these licenses a year. But this is only the first gate in the system. A CPL holder is not an airline pilot, much like you wouldn't give your car to just anyone with a driving license. To actually fly passengers on, say, an Airbus A320, the aircraft that makes up the bulk of India's fleet, you need a type rating, which effectively means you're certified to fly that specific plane. This takes another couple of months of training for that aircraft, and this costs the pilot anywhere up to 25 lakh rupees over and above what they've already spent. Naturally, nobody gives you a full blown aircraft to fly this early. Instead, you practice on level D simulators, devices that actually make you feel the motion of that aircraft. Sadly, India only has a few of these, concentrated at a handful of facilities in Bangalore, Gurgaon, and Hyderabad. Finding a slot can be hard. Even now, you aren't ready to fly. First, you need to finish your airline induction. Step by step, you're made to understand the airline's processes and are then slowly eased into flying until the airline trusts your ability to fly passengers on your own. This takes the better part of a year. And once you're done, you can become a first officer. That is, you earn a seat in the cockpit. But you still cannot command a flight. So, to become a captain, to be the pilot in command that actually gets to head a commercial flight, you legally need at least 1,500 hours of flight time. In practice, airlines require 2,500 to 3,500 hours before they're willing to bump you up. And then you need to pass a command upgrade process, which includes a Viva examination administered by the DGCA. There is, unfortunately, a shortage of examiners at the DGCA, and according to some reports from last year, in fact, half the technical posts at the body are vacant. Now, this is part of a wider problem. The number of pilots you can put through any year depends on the number of older, more experienced pilots you already have. These are important cogs in the machine, and these pilots become training captains and designated examiners. They have to be around for a young pilot to advance. It's only when you have these that you can bring other pilots up the ladder. These are the sorts of pilots Gulf carriers most aggressively recruit. Now, to run a plane, you don't just need a pilot, you need a captain. India has thousands of certified pilots that are at the beginning of a long journey, and from here, they have many thousands of hours of training and flying ahead of them. At each step, they will have to deal with scarcity: money, simulators, training pilots, examiners, and more. There aren't enough people who have completed this entire journey. Now, this is a funnel with a wide mouth and a narrow neck. The width of the neck, however, depends on the number of in-demand experienced pilots you have. So here's one way of thinking about how many pilots any airline needs. So a single narrow-body aircraft like an A320, the kind that makes up 90% of India's fleet, flies roughly 10 to 12 hours every day. Each flight requires two pilots, and any one pilot can fly about 65 to 80 hours a month. So you need somewhere between 10 and 14 pilots for every aircraft. Ideally, you might want more so that you can buffer for those that are sick or on leave. In the US, airlines typically run 12 to 16. Now let's compare that to India's numbers. Indigo has 7.6 pilots per aircraft. The others cluster around 9. Nobody even crosses 10. But Indigo is clearly an outlier. It has a massive fleet of aircraft of a single type, and as a facet of its cost discipline, constantly optimizes its pilots' schedules to fly as many flights as possible. This has made Indigo the most profitable airline in India. But with just 7.6 pilots a plane, there's absolutely no room for error. Now consider this. Between 2022 and 2024, Indigo hired 14 pilots for every plane they acquired. Air India, in contrast, hired 23. And so, when the new FDTL norms kicked into place late in 2025, Indigo found itself almost 700 pilots short. What once looked like efficiency became the very reason they were hurt worse than the rest of the industry. So, India needs more captains. Every commercial flight legally needs a captain, so the size of our aviation industry directly depends on how many captains we have. Unfortunately, it takes years for a pilot to become a captain, which creates a fundamental speed limit for India's aviation industry. Meanwhile, at least until recently, airlines from across the Gulf, like Emirates, Riyadh Air, or Etihad, were looking at India for new pilots as well. With every pilot, you lose many years of experience in an industry where experience requirements are literally coded into the law. This is why India formally petitioned ICAO for a global code of conduct to regulate cross-border pilot recruitment. But the proposal was rejected. Of course, with the Gulf now on fire, this could change quickly, but if and when it recovers, the pull will begin again. Alongside captains, we also need more people to clear the other bottlenecks in the system, like pilots who are type rated and can be inducted into the system. And we need more of the sort of people that can staff the pipeline in between. Now, India's airlines have currently ordered roughly 1,700 new aircraft, with Indigo and Air India alone seeking around 1,000 between them. The industry needs roughly 2,000 to 2,100 new pilots a year to service those planes. Currently, India issues about 1,600 pilot licenses a year, and the gap is notable but not impossible. But the mouth of the funnel was never the problem. The problem is the narrow neck. When a system is built over decades, it can't just scale in a few years. India doesn't have a pilot shortage, but it has a captain shortage, a simulator shortage, a training pilot shortage, and an examiner shortage. Unfortunately, those are what really matter. We listened to a lot of con calls while researching our stories, so we started a newsletter called The Chatter. It's a curated collection of the sharpest management quotes for that week in a neat and readable format published every Friday. The link is in the description. Coming to the second story. Before a coal mine opens, someone has to find the coal, map the geology, design the mine, get past regulators, and then keep measuring everything while the mine runs. In most of India's history, that someone has been one company, Central Mine Planning and Design Institute, or CMPDI. So, CMPDI is Coal India's in house advisor or consultant, but it's not like other advisory firms. This is a company with drill rigs in the field, 8 laboratories, 7 regional institutes stationed near India's major coal fields, and the largest fleet of exploratory drills for coal in the country. It wouldn't be a stretch to call it Coal India's entire technical nervous system. We'll unpack what that means as we go. So, CMPDI is now going public. The IPO is an offer for sale worth Rs 1,842 crore, with Coal India selling its stake. The company itself receives nothing from the issue. So the natural question is, what exactly is being put on the stock market here? Let's start from the ground up. So the best way to understand CMPDI's business is to follow the life cycle of a coal mine from start to finish. In stage 1, you find the coal. The Ministry of Coal identifies a potential coal block, and at this point, nobody knows how much coal is down there, what grade it is, or whether the economics work. So somebody has to go find out. CMPDI sends rigs into the ground, pulls out core samples, maps the rock formations underneath, and runs tests to figure out what's down there and how much of it is worth extracting. In the end, it puts together a formal resource estimate report that says this block contains X million tons of coal of Y grade at Z depth. Nothing moves forward without this document. No mine gets designed and no investment decision gets made, but this is CMPDI's biggest business. Geological exploration and resource evaluation accounts for approximately 46% of its revenue. Stage 2 is designing the mine. Once the resource estimate confirms there's coal worth extracting, someone has to figure out how to get it out, and that involves asking a lot of questions. Will it be an open cast or underground mine? What will be the sequence of extraction? What equipment should be used? Anyway, CMPDI produces a feasibility study and detailed project report containing the possible answers, which goes to Coal India's board for approval. This mine planning and design vertical make up approximately 20% of revenue. Now, stage 3, getting past regulators. India has extremely heavy environmental regulation around mining. Now, before a single ton of earth moves, the project needs an environmental impact assessment or EIA, an environmental management plan, forest clearance if the block sits on forest land, and consent from the state pollution boards. With these many approvals, it's probably no surprise that at this stage, projects routinely get delayed by years. CMPDI prepares all of this paperwork, and this vertical makes up approximately 18% of their revenue. The last stage is monitoring the already running mine. Somebody needs to verify how much coal has been extracted, whether boundaries are being respected, or whether underground fires are developing, a real problem in Indian coal fields. CMPDI does GPS surveys, LiDAR scans, drone-based mapping, and fire mapping, and this is the geomatics and survey vertical, making up approximately 17% of revenue. Once CMPDI does the exploration, it naturally does the mine plan, since it knows the geology, then the environment impact assessment, since it knows the site, and hence the ongoing surveys also. Switching consultants mid-life cycle is costly and risky, and this stickiness is the actual moat, not technology, not AI, not any other buzzword. And none of this work can be done by just anyone. Geological exploration, environmental impact assessments, mine planning, these all require formal accreditation from government bodies. You can't prepare an EIA without being accredited by the Quality Council of India, and that limits how many firms can even participate in this market. CMPDI's top 10 clients account for over 93% of revenue. Coal India and its subsidiaries alone contribute roughly two-thirds. Government entities overall make up 96 to 99%. Instead of hosting competitive tenders that would invite private players too, the government simply nominates CMPDI to do their work. So the question of whether CMPDI is genuinely the best at what it does or simply the beneficiary of a captive relationship is hard to untangle. The honest answer might be both. CMPDI is the custodian of India's entire coal and lignite geological database. Imagine having 50 years of drilling data, over 700 geological reports, all from executing the coal life cycle countless times. It's also the nodal agency for the government on coal R&D and an implementing agency for exploration programs under the National Mineral Exploration Trust. They do have the technical depth and regulatory embeddedness, but they also exist inside a structure where the biggest client is also the sole shareholder and the entity that appoints the board. In the broader mining advisory market, though, the consultant side is fragmented. There exist a few smaller players, but nobody that rivals CMPDI's scale or data advantage in coal. Competition does exist at the margins, especially as coal block auctions bring private miners who might hire other firms. But inside Coal India's own ecosystem, CMPDI is effectively a monopoly. However, in non-coal work, the competitive picture flips entirely. CMPDI has started picking up work in critical minerals like lithium, rare earths, and copper under government programs. India wants to reduce its dependence on mineral imports, but the geological expertise in coal doesn't transfer cleanly for CMPDI. See, coal is sedimentary rock, but critical minerals typically sit in hard rock formations requiring different drilling techniques and different domain expertise. In that space, the Geological Survey of India and Mineral Exploration and Consultancy Limited already have institutional advantages. International firms like SRK Consulting have decades of hard rock experience, while CMPDI has just 3 international assignments in total. On the surface, CMPDI's financials look remarkably strong. Revenue grew from Rs 1,386 crore in FY23 to Rs 2,103 crore in FY25, a 23% CAGR. Profit after tax more than doubled from Rs 297 crore to Rs 667 crore. EBITDA margins sit above 40%. Return on capital employed hit 48.6% in FY25, and the company has zero debt. For an advisory business, these are really good numbers. But where is the growth coming from? Interestingly, between FY24 and FY25, revenue from Coal India barely moved, but revenue from outside Coal India nearly doubled to Rs 842 crore. The share of non-CIL in the total also doubled from 17% in FY23 to 34% in FY25. Client count went from 38 to 76 over the same period. Clearly, CMPDI is finding work elsewhere, like government coal block auctions creating demand from private miners, Ministry of Coal scheme work, and some early critical mineral mandates. Those are good signs, but the quality of growth needs interrogation. On the cost front, the margin story is more nuanced than it first appears. Employee benefits collapsed from 67% of total expenses in FY23 to 47% in FY25, driven by retirement attrition in a government workforce that isn't being fully replaced. But the cost didn't just vanish. Other expenses, primarily outsourced exploration and vendor costs, more than doubled over the same period. In FY25, more than half of CMPDI's drilling was done by outside contractors and not its own rigs. The delivery model is slowly shifting from an in-house government workforce to one that orchestrates external vendors. Margins expanded, but partly because cost moved from one line item to another, not because the underlying economics became dramatically more efficient. And then there's cash conversion, probably the biggest problem for them. CMPDI carries almost 8 months of revenue uncollected. Over rupees 2,800 crore is past due beyond 6 months. Coal India's own subsidiaries own nearly rupees 1,000 crore in old outstandings, and that number keeps growing. A company that can't collect from its own parent is an odd thing to take public. All of that makes the coal business clear enough. But that's not what makes this company genuinely interesting, at least for us. It's their activity outside of coal in critical minerals. Now, India is waking up to the fact that it needs to find and secure its own supplies of lithium and rare earths. The government is pouring money into exploration through programs like NMET and Mission Critical Minerals. CMPDI, as the country's largest mining consultancy with exploration infrastructure already in the ground, sits right at the center of that push. And unlike coal, where demand has a visible plateau sometime in the 2030s, critical minerals have much longer demand visibility. If CMPDI could build a genuine franchise here, the business transforms from a coal cycle story into something with a fundamentally longer runway. But the right to win is hard to find. The mining consultancy market itself grows at just 4.8% a year, below nominal GDP. The operational texture still reads like a PSU department and not a capital markets grade company. And the next pay commission revision could push employee costs up 20 to 25% overnight, compressing the very margins that make the stock look attractive. CMPDI has a genuine monopoly in a business that works but has a ceiling. The most exciting, high growth part of its future is precisely where the evidence is thinnest. And right now, their aspiration to achieve that growth is ahead of the proof. Now, coming to the tidbits. HDFC Bank's part-time chairman Atanu Chakraborty resigned abruptly, saying certain happenings and practices at the bank over the past 2 years weren't in line with his personal values and ethics. He didn't specify what those practices were. The stock crashed approximately 5% to a 52-week low, erasing over rupees 65,000 crore in market cap. The RBI issued a public statement saying the bank remains well capitalized with no material concerns on record. Coming to the next tidbit. Novo Nordisk's Indian patent on semaglutide, the molecule behind Ozempic and Wegovy, expires today, March 20th. Sun Pharma, Dr. Reddy's, Zydus, Lupin, and Mankind Pharma are all planning day one launches with around 50 branded generics expected to hit the market. Monthly therapy costs are expected to drop from rupees 10,000 to 12,000 to around rupees 3,500 to 4,000. Jeffries has called it a magic pill moment, estimating the domestic semaglutide market could eventually hit $1 billion. Coming to the final tidbit. The Union Cabinet approved the Small Hydropower Development Scheme for FY 27-31, targeting 1,500 megawatt of new capacity through projects in the 1 to 25 megawatt range with a focus on hilly and northeastern states. The rupees 2,584.6 crore outlay is expected to crowd in roughly rupees 15,000 crore in private investment, with all plant and machinery sourced domestically. That's all the news I have for you. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.
Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.